Dirty Politics, Hard Times, a Trilogy of Chartism, narrated by the author, Malc Cowle. Book 1. The Manchester Chartist. Chapter 1. Sons of poverty assemble, rouse them from their silken slumbers, trouble them amidst their pride, swell your ranks, augment your numbers, spread your charter far and wide. Truth is with us, God himself is on our side. Pigs bollocks, God's on nobody's side, he's dead if e'er he existed. You're a cynical old so-and-so, Tom, that's the Chartist, him, show respect. Tom Oldham turned his tired watery grey eyes onto his young companion, his lungs full of cotton dust, his hands cut and gnarled, his fingers twisted and deformed, his face a mass of lines and wrinkles. He already looked an old man, at the age of 31. Don't thee be getting involved with them radicals, young Ackroyd. They'll regret it if thou dost. Something's got to be done, Daniel responded sharply, more than a touch of exasperation in his voice. We can't keep living from hand to mouth like this, never knowing from one day to next if we have a job to go to, and every time we get a new one it's lower paid. Thee should count thy blessings. Thy missus in work, ain't she? Aye, Bess is, and she's suffering as a result. Nobody should be working 12-hour shifts in the mill. Young Daniel's suffering as well. It's me should be labouring. Bess should be at home with lads suckling her breast. Trouble with thee, Daniel, is thee don't know when thou art lucky. There's plenty of men clamming for lack of work, and they hasn't got women folk to bring money in. Aye, you're right, the lad replied with a defiant shake of his head, and that's why we need to get up off his knees and fight for the charter. Nay, lad, I had similar ideas when my feyther took me up to Petersfield's back in 1819. Fat lot of good that done us. Ended up covered in my feyther's blood and gore with a widowed mother to look after. Thou art a good lad, Daniel, but think of thy son. Kep out of it. That's my advice, and I hope thee takes it. Tom knocked back his beer, stood up, donned his battered old hat, raked it at a jaunty angle, and walked out of the pothouse. The lad remained silent, trying to understand his mentor's feelings. Old Tom would have been about 12 when he'd accompanied his father to St. Peter's Fields, just 19 years before. Although he'd never met him, he knew Tom's father was a weaver, as was Tom. Daniel had only been 1 year old the year of the Peterloo massacre, but few Manchester folk were unaware of the horrific events that fateful day. It remained part of the town's folklore. Over 60,000 people had assembled on St. Peter's Fields to listen to Henry Hunt, Richard Carlile, Samuel Bamford and others argue the case for parliamentary reform. Most of the people were angry. Many were handloom weavers thrown out of work by mechanisation and the rapid growth of the factory system. Manchester's population was expanding fast and unemployment rife. Working people reduced to living in overcrowded hovels amongst filth and squalor. Despite the widespread misery and resentment, the intention was to hold a peaceful demonstration. Over a third of those present were women, the majority dressed in white. Deliberately so, for white was the symbol of peace. Many had children with them. Nonetheless, not for the first time, the establishment panicked. The government feared an insurrection, the French Revolution still fresh in their minds. They persuaded magistrates to mobilise the Salford and Manchester Yeoman Cavalry and 400 special constables. A Royal Horse Artillery unit with 2 6-pounder guns and 400 men of the Cheshire Yeomanry reinforced them. As Henry Hunt took the platform, the magistrates sent in the constables to arrest him for sedition, garbling out the riot act. The crowd moved in to protect their speakers. A bloody massacre resulted. The cavalry rode into the crowd, slashing out with their sabres indiscriminately. 19 people lost their lives that day. Over 500 suffered serious injuries. Now, in September 1838, Tom's unhappiness with his intentions to attend the meeting on Kersal Moor provided food for thought. To witness your own father cut down and cleaved almost in two before your very eyes must have been horrific for the 12-year-old. No doubt the horror was just as vivid now in Tom's mind as it was back then. At the same time, Daniel remained convinced of the need for serious action. He'd managed to obtain just 3 days' work in the past fortnight, and knew he was a damn sight luckier than many of his compatriots. The Manchester Guardian had reported the week before that no less than 50,000 workers in Salford, Manchester, and the surrounding textile towns were either out of work or on short-time hours. The Corn Laws, implemented by Lord Liverpool's government in 1815 to keep the price of wheat high in the face of cheap imports, had forced the price of bread and flour to the point where people couldn't afford a loaf. Richard Cobden had formed the Anti-Corn Law League based in Manchester earlier that year to seek repeal and fight for free trade. Brought up in poverty, despite the best efforts of his own father and mother, both of whom had died from typhus before they were 40, Daniel had determined his own son, young Daniel, just a year old, should have a better future. He finished his glass of small beer and set off for home in nearby Ancoats, intent on informing Bess of his plans for the morning. Bess Ackroyd finished sweeping the bare floor of the downstairs room, closed the door, and placed the broom against the wall. The room was chilly with damp. She crossed the flags to tend the fire, adding a couple of pieces of coal to the rapidly dying embers. Her husband would be home soon. She'd need to get the kettle boiled. Satisfied with her labour, she went over to the old wicker basket that served as young Daniel's cradle, and lifted him gently into her arms. He awoke and looked up at his mother's face, his large dark brown eyes gazing intently into hers, as if to discern her innermost thoughts. She smiled at him as she undid her blouse and latched him on to a swollen nipple. "Suck thee fill, our Daniel, afore your feyther's on wanting his tay." She cupped the back of her baby's head gently with the palm of her hand. Bess would be 19 in November, a slightly built, handsome country lass with hair almost as black as the contents of her coal bucket. Her eyes, an exact match of her child's deep dark brown, contrasted sharply with her sallow complexion, the hallmark of a mill worker, employed for long hours without seeing natural daylight. She was tired, although it was a Sunday, the one day of the week when she was free from the burden of wage slavery. She spent the last 4 hours with her friends finishing off a job they'd been working on for months. She wondered what Daniel would say when she took him to see it. She cast her eyes around the room, which along with a cramped bedroom upstairs comprised their home. When they'd first moved in the place just 18 months before, the floor had been bare earth. Over time, one slab here and one slab there, Daniel had paved it with gritstone flags. Where he'd obtained them from she'd never asked. She didn't need to. Daniel was a proud, practical man, a skilled carpenter by trade, and above all, honest. Sparsely furnished, the room contained 2 wooden chairs Daniel had received from an employer unable to pay him cash, or so the type miscreant had said, and a sturdy deal kitchen table made by himself. These occupied the space under the window, looking out on the tiny yard with the privy Daniel had constructed, a luxury not many working folk enjoyed. Against the wall, to the left-hand side of the door, resided an old wooden iron-bound chest, left in a local pawnshop by some long-forgotten sailor. In this they kept their clothes and a few prized possessions. When they had company, it served as a double seat. Next to it stood the wicker basket in which they placed their soiled clothes ready for washing. On the right-hand side of the fireplace, against the one wall free from damp and mildew, stood Daniel's pride and joy, a solid oak bookcase he'd manufactured the previous winter to house their small collection of books and pamphlets. Daniel's father had insisted the lads should be able to read and write. Although Bess had never met him, she knew some of Jeremiah's sayings off by heart, one of them being, Larding's far better than silver or gold." Bess shook her head at the thought. She knew what her late father-in-law meant, and didn't disagree with him about education, being an avid reader herself. None the less, a bit of spare brass, let alone silver or gold, wouldn't go amiss now and again. The only other furniture was a small deal dresser which housed their few bits of china and cutlery, pots and pans, flanking the other side of the fireplace. "Still," she mused, "we're better off than most." The sound of the door opening interrupted her thoughts. A smile lit up her face as her husband stood before her. "Sit this hand down, Daniel. Soon as young un's had his fill, I'll mash your tea. Dunna rush, lass, I'll put kettle on." He walked over to her, looked down at his son for a brief moment, and kissed the end of her up-tilted nose affectionately, as he invariably did when they met after parting for any length of time. She watched him as he bent down and picked up the fire-iron to swing the cast-iron pot-holder out over the grate. He retrieved the old iron kettle and placed it in position over the burning coals. 5 foot 6 inches tall, he was slim and wiry, typical of his class, Manchester-born and bred and never overfed. In her eyes, the most handsome and considerate man in the world. She wouldn't swap him for all the tea in China. He took his place in the seat opposite her. "Thee look tired, Daniel. I were just about to say same about you, Bess. I've had a good productive day, I can't complain." "Productive? How do they mean?" "I'll show thee later," she said, a twinkle in her eye. "Thou art invited to a celebration. We've to be at Mary Upton's, be 6 sharp." "A celebration? What's Mary got to celebrate?" "They'll just have to wait and see, Daniel Ackroyd. What was it thy old man told thee? Patience is a virtue." "My old man used to say many things, including the meek shall inherit the earth, but he were wrong," Daniel replied, pulling her face. "The meek get trampled on by rich and powerful, and that's truth of it." "What's got into thee, Daniel? You sound angry." "Nay, lass, I'm not angry. Not any more. I'm determined. Time for anger's past. I'm bent on action." She gazed at him, wondering what ideas occupied his head. "I'm joining t'others. I'm marching on to t'moor in morning, and there's nowt you can say to stop me." Her eyes narrowed and a frown creased her brow. "And what makes thee think I'd object?" "Well, I just thought—" "They just thought, did they? Well, I'll tell thee this, lad. If they weren't planning a joint rest, I'd ha' left thee looking after babby." She grinned as she stood up and walked across the room to place young Daniel back in his basket. "Mary Upton's looking after all the young uns. Every one of us working in mills marching to Kersal Moor tomorrow." She fastened her blouse and walked back to her husband, cupping his cheeks in her hands. "Give us a proper kiss on th' lips, Daniel, unless they don't want to demonstrate for Charter with me. We've declared holiday, and towed our Heathrow he might as well keep mill doors locked for all that money he's going to make out of our labour tomorrow. They'll be welcome to join us. They can link me arm when they aren't carrying banner." The dimples formed under his cheeks as he brought his lips to hers. They kissed, and he turned in his seat, put his arms around her hips, and gently swung her round until she sat on his knee. "I don't deserve you, lass. You're a girt shaft of sunlight in an o'ercast gloomy world, and that's simple truth o' it. Come here, thee great lummock. Thou art ray o' sunshine that brightens my days if e'er there was one," she said affectionately. "So, what do you reckon to our work, Daniel?" The carpenter stood with young Daniel clasped to his chest, gazing at the great blue silk banner hung on the barn wall, its message distinctive in red, gold and white letters. "It's wonderful. A work o' art if e'er I says one, Mary. How many hours' labour went into it?" The midwife shook her head. "We ne'er counted, lad. There were o'er 20 women worked on it. We made time when we could. Your Bess were one of the leaders. You should be proud o' her. She's a reet gradely lass and kept all our spirits up. It must have cost a fair bit." "It did, lad, but we were lucky. The union provided money for sewing thread and the needles and such, and we had an unexpected benefactor. A benefactor? Aye, our dead Rose's daughter, Irene Rose. Mary shook her head, a twinkle in her eyes. Seems she's a friend of Bessie's and a secret supporter at cause. She provided soap for Banner. It's worth a fortune. Daniel nodded. Aye, Miss Rose is a kind-hearted lass. He laughed, a thought crossing his mind. I bet her father won't be well pleased if he finds out. A voice interrupted. A pity there's got main message wrong. What do you mean by that, Jasper Clayton? As far as I know, first him on at Charters for universal male suffrage. The words on the banner said Labour, the father of all wealth, nature, its mother, universal suffrage, annual parliaments, Peterloo, not forgotten, not forgiven, Gibraltar Mill cotton operatives united for the Charter, peaceful if possible, forceful if not. It's a shame we didn't have your help, experience and advice when we was macking it, Jasper, Mary said, a wry smile on her face. But there's plenty of thread and materials left on yon table if you want to put it right. You're welcome to use 'em. Nae need to take off and be offended, Mary Upton. I'm only pointing out campaigns for male suffrage. Thee art wrong there, Jasper, Bess Ackroyd intervened, a touch of sharpness in her voice. Yon banners work at Gibraltar Mill operatives, as it plainly states, and most of us are women, in case you hadn't noticed. Them art our demands, and we choose 'em with great care, each and every one. We're after right to vote as well, and they might as well be knowing it sooner than later. They can spread it round rest of men folk while thou art at it. You tell him, Bess. Daniel laughed and turned to Jasper. I think you'd best make your own banner if you're not prepared to support the women. I'll tell thee what, Jasper, if you're not happy marching behind banner, I can do with a little help tomorrow, Mary intervened. I needs to entertain over 40 little uns. You're a kindly man and a natural clown, and we could make a costume out of scraps we have left o'er. How about it? You'll look right gradely in blue and gold silk with a red hat and belt. Chapter 2. Art they managing, Daniel? Aye, Bess, I'll be fine. I'll just let on if they need relief, love. I've men queuing up to carry banner. It's a remarkable turnout, and weather couldn't be better, lass. We had Charlie Sykes at Millgates looking out for us. He's just caught us up and made his report. Our Deathrow had done as we asked and locked gates. Charlie reckons only a couple of old lookers turned up, and they turned around when they realised Mill were locked. Unbeknownst to Daniel, a friend stood at Kersal Bar waiting for the Manchester contingent to march past Strangeways and up Bury New Road. Once it reached the bar, it would swing left onto Moor Lane, and from there onto Kersal Moor itself. Dead on 10:30, the trade union delegations from Manchester began their journey, headed by a lone bugler on horseback. Immediately behind him marched a brass band, accompanied by a banner proclaiming the 6 demands of the Charter: universal male suffrage, vote by ballot, abolition of the property qualifications for MPs, payment for MPs, equal electoral constituencies, annual parliaments. Members of the Manchester Political Union and the Manchester Suffrage Association, the joint sponsors of the rally, proudly walked behind. Next, following their own colourful banner, marched an army of tailors, 525 strong, easily counted, because they comprised 105 files, each file 5 abreast. In their wake marched a myriad of other trades, each with their own banners and many led by bands. 400 members of the Steam Engine Friendly Society headed a contingent of untold numbers of blacksmiths, wheelwrights and millwrights. Following these came a large and boisterous crowd of handloom weavers, most of them Irish. Over 800 members of the Dyers and Dressers Union processed in their wake, followed by hundreds of powerloom weavers. The massed ranks of the Cotton Spinners Union appeared in their turn, with the Gibraltar Mill banner to the fore, and still they came, the Manchester regiment of the labouring poor, an impoverished but jovial array of humanity, with the most radical participants, the shoemakers, marching in unison as if going into battle, singing and laughing in the vanguard, their banners and flags, a riot of colour and revolutionary slogans. Old Tom Oldham looked on in amazement as the serried ranks passed him by at Kersal Bar. He checked the time the bugler had reached him on his fob watch. It was over 40 minutes later before the last line of 5 of the Manchester contingent passed in front of them. They weren't marching slow. Tom reckoned they'd be doing at least 3.5 miles an hour. However, for argument's sake, he calculated the length of the column using the lower figure of 3 miles an hour. That meant 1 mile of people passed him 5 abreast every 20 minutes. So the Manchester contingent alone had been 2 miles long. If they'd marched in single file, they'd have stretched for 10 miles. Onlookers had clapped and cheered them throughout the length of their promenade. The whole parade was a riot of colour, good-natured banter and laughter, accompanied by stirring music. The issues at stake were serious, the people participating setting out grim and determined, facing an enemy who regarded them as little more than animals, a pair of hands, to be put to work when their employers found it necessary to employ them, and cast aside, to beg, steal, borrow or starve when they didn't. But their very act of combining together to stand up to win the same democratic rights as their masters and to end political corruption gave them a confidence that turned the whole occasion into a gigantic and exuberant festival. As they passed Kersal Bar, one of the shoemakers began to sing verses from Shelley's popular poem, The Mask of Anarchy, inspired by Peterloo. He began with Shelley's question, "What art thou, freedom?" His fellows joined in, singing out the answer with great enthusiasm, much to the delight of their listeners. "Thou art not, as impostors say, a shadow soon to pass away, a superstition and a name, echoing from the eaves of fame. For the labourer thou art bred, and a comely table spread, from his daily labour come, in a neat and happy home. Thou art clothes and fire and food, for the trampled multitude, knowing countries that are free, such starvation cannot be, as in England now we see. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number, shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep hath fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few." Daniel hadn't spotted Tom standing on the opposite side of the road, but Tom had spotted Daniel. As soon as the last shoemaker had passed, he chased after to find the youngster and his wife, his worn-out cotton-filled lungs forcing him to wheeze like an old steam engine. The moor soon became a heaving mass of tens of thousands of people, eager to listen to the words of the speakers, in particular those of the Irish Chartist and legendary owner of the Northern Star, Fergus O'Connor. Contingents from Salford, Lee, Oldham, Middleton, Bury, Rochdale, Stalybridge and Stockport, Ashton-under-Lyne and Droylsden, Unsworth and Bolton, Tottington and Eccles, together with representatives of the Macclesfield silk workers, augmented the host of Manchester people. According to the Manchester Guardian, over 30 bands took part, providing musical entertainment. Bess Ackroyd felt overwhelmed, elated by the sheer number of women and children in attendance, although if she'd thought about it, she wouldn't have been so surprised. In most of the towns represented, women comprised an important and substantial part of the textile mills workforce, as indeed did children, many mills employing boys and girls from the age of 9, and sometimes younger. The women in many ways suffered the brunt of pressures resulting from industrial accidents, the widespread domestic overcrowding, unsanitary and dangerous living conditions, and poor health, all too prevalent as a direct result of factory life and mechanization. Cholera, typhus, scarlet fever and consumption, or tuberculosis as it became known, were common diseases. If a woman escaped them, she was expected to nurse and maintain the menfolk, children, and female relatives who weren't so lucky. Bess was overjoyed to see that the Gibraltar Mill contingent were not the only ones to miss out the word male from their demand for suffrage. The Berry contingent carried 13 flags bearing the demands universal suffrage, votes by ballot, and labour, the source of all wealth. Although the press ignored it, the speakers addressing the meeting chose not to mention it, and many of the male-dominated trade unions wouldn't acknowledge it. Women were to the fore in organising behind the scenes. Without them, the great demonstration, later acknowledged as probably the most significant political event of the 19th century, wouldn't have been so successful. The women in the main made the banners, spoke out in the mills and in their unions, and organised the thousands of placards that had sprouted up on walls and posts for miles around the Manchester and Salford areas over the preceding weeks. The Manchester women Chartists had made an emotional appeal to their sisters of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales, and raised over £50 as a result. This was a great deal of money. Young Bess Ackroyd was a skilled cotton operative, a spinner, and old Ethrow was by no means the worst-paying mill owner in Manchester. She started work at 6 in the morning, and worked until 8. She then had half an hour for breakfast, which gave her time to go to Mary Upton's and breastfeed young Daniel. She returned to the mill and worked from 8:30 until 1, when again she was able to look after Daniel's and her own needs, before returning to her spinning mule at 2. From then on she worked through until 8:30 at night, save for half an hour at 5 to feed Daniel once more. She did this 6 days a week except for Saturdays when she finished work at 5. For her 69.5 hours labour, she received the princely sum of 14 shillings. In other words, to earn £50, she'd have to labour for near enough 1 year and 20 weeks. "Daniel, Daniel!" The lad looked around. "What are you doing here, Tom?" Let me get my breath back." "Sit thyself down, old lad," Daniel said, taking his old friend by the arm, concerned by his wheezing. "Nay, Daniel, if I sets down, I might ne'er rise again. I'll be right in a minute. I thought I'd lost thee." "You're the last person I expected to see after the lecture you gave me yesterday afternoon." Well, I were wrong, I guess. I were being a mad ass, and I felt need to tell thee. I had a dream last night." He shook his head. "It were uncanny. Me old feyther, God bless his soul, stole into me head whilst I were fast asleep. He looked as true to life as thou art to me now, Daniel." He looked at his friend, a rather grave, serious expression on his face. "Get up off thy knees, Tom Oldham," he told me. "If thou canna do it for thyself, do it to honour me." "Well, Daniel, as you say, I'm here, and I'm doing it for myself as well as me feyther, and thou art me witness, seeing as there's nae God to vouch for me." "Good for thee, Tom. I'm reet pleased to see you, and so will our Bess be. We'll walk home together after the meeting, and we'll feed you and make a reet fuss of you, so we will." He looked around, searching for his wife. "There you are, Bess, love," he shouted. "Look who's come to greet us." Bess's face broke into a beaming smile. "Tom Oldham, of all people, you're thunny on bread, and that's an understatement. Come here, give me a hug, thee old devil. I hasna seen thee for weeks. Where have thee been hiding?" Old Tom, Bess and Daniel walked back to Manchester together. It was raining, but a blizzard would have failed to curb their spirits. They weren't sure exactly how many had attended the rally to endorse the People's Charter and to begin the process of collecting signatures for the petition to Parliament urging its enactment. but Tom assured them it far exceeded the 60,000 who'd been on St. Peter's Fields 19 years previously. Moreover, unlike Peterloo, it had been a perfect day. The weather remained dry for most of the event, and the authorities seemed to have learnt one lesson at least, and kept a low profile. They turned off Berry-New Road onto Ducie Street. As they crossed Ducie Bridge to enter the area comprising the original township, by then commonly known as Old Town or Irish Town, Tom stopped. "Let me show you something whilst we're here." They looked over the bridge's northern parapet to the Manchester bank of the Urt. The river's waters were black with effluent from a nearby dye works. They seemed to absorb all light, and the stench was almost intolerable. Both sides of the Urt at this point sported tanneries, size manufactories, numerous pigsties, a slaughterhouse and tripe works, with clusters of slum dwellings in their shade. They followed Tom's pointing finger. In a deep gully, between two high banks, stood a large cluster of some of the most dilapidated and broken-down buildings of the town. "That's Gibraltar," Tom said grimly. "That's where the cholera epidemic of 1831 started. It were a slum then like it's a slum today, one of the worst slums in a slum town." The whole area was a mass of narrow courts dominated by a large tannery, some 8 stories high, 3 of which contained animal skins hung up and exposed to the open air as part of the tanning process. "One of the first victims was an Irish lad, a mate of me father's," Tom said quietly. "He'd fought in the Peninsular Wars under Wellesley, him who became Wellington. So many of the British troops were Irish and didn't speak out but Irish. Their officers had to learn their language or use interpreters. Irish Michael were an interpreter and a war hero. He lost 3 times in Spain." He paused and looked at his friends. "Irish get a lot of stick round here, but folk forget why they're here in first place, dispossessed of their own land and forced to serve a German king, or to work in mills as weavers or slave as navvies, cutting canals and railways. Anyway, after Waterloo, when Napoleonic Wars finally ended, Michael were reduced to selling matches and lived in one of them cottages alongside 3 other families in one room in Yon Allen Court. Cholera seized him on a Sunday and lad died on Wednesday. On that day, 5 other cases of cholera occurred amongst the inhabitants at same court. All were fatal, and cholera spread like wildfire through Irish Town. The houses should have been knocked down and area cleaned up, but they're still as bad as ever they were, if not worse. There's pigs running free in them courts, feeding on garbage and offal, and there's all kinds of shit and goodness only knows what else in all passages. They reckon rats have fled up Long Millgate to Ancoats, conditions aren't so bad." He shook his head in disgust. "Year after that, we got Great Betrayal, what Micers call Great Reform Act. They'd go us to parade and drill on Kersal Moor year in, year out after Peterloo to put fear of God up landed gentry, promising us working man would have right to vote as well as 'em. But once they'd got vote for middle-class mill owners and merchants, they turned their backs on us who won it for 'em. Fergus O'Connor were dead reet today when he said Parliament were a set of vagabond cowards, the Whigs devils and the Tories devils in hell." "Aye, Tom, thou art reet, lad," Bess agreed with a wry smile. "We need to sweep vipers out of their parliamentary nest and replace 'em with good honest working folk, and hold 'em to annual account to stop 'em becoming warped and adopting ways of rich folks." Chapter 3. By 9 o'clock, Bess and Daniel Ackroyd had long since bade farewell to Tom and retired to bed. Both would rise at 5 in the morning, Bess to face another day of wage slavery in Gibraltar Mill, the next 12 hours of her working life at the service of, and governed by, the speed of the spinning mule, whilst Daniel continued to tramp around Manchester, hoping to find a sign saying, "Hands wanted." If he couldn't find work as a carpenter or a joiner, he'd try anything. Matthew Etherow, the owner of Gibraltar Cotton Mill, had neither the need nor the inclination to rise so early. He'd just finished a splendid meal in the company of his 19-year-old daughter, Irene Rose, and his guests, Nathaniel West and his good lady wife, Emma. Nathaniel, a fair-haired, blue-eyed, rather brash, self-opinionated young man of 21 years, managed the Nelson Mill, situated next to Matthew's on Loom Street in Ancoats, on behalf of his father, who owned two other mills, one in Bolton and one in Salford. He liked to inform strangers he was a self-made man, although Matthew knew he hardly had the capacity to make a decent fart. Unlike the Wests, Matthew was in a good mood. Evidently, earlier in the day, Nathaniel and his beloved had threaded their way through the commercial district to attend a memorial service at the Collegiate Church off Fennell Street. They'd emerged just in time to witness the shoemaker's contingent passing by. One of the banners these fustian-coated specimens of the lower classes proudly carried bore the slogan, "Remember Peterloo," with the words liberty, equality, fraternity emblazoned beneath. To make matters worse, the workmen wore headgear that looked suspiciously like the symbol of the French Revolution, the cap of liberty, which their banner also portrayed. Nathaniel, being a loyal subject of the Crown, had taken great exception to this Republican message, and told them in no uncertain terms they should bugger off back to France. One of the shoemakers had smiled, and much to the amusement of his friends and a gang of onlookers, replied, "Mais non, monsieur, promenade avec us up to Kersal Moor. You can help us check out guillotines sharp, if you care to stick your neck out." Both Matthew and his daughter had failed to suppress their laughter on hearing this news from the lips of their guest, much to West's chagrin. "My advice is not to provoke the operatives," Matthew responded. "The fact is, they have a just cause, and it's time the manufacturers, of which I'm one and you're another, took cognizance of the situation." Nathaniel couldn't believe his ears, and even Irene Rose was somewhat surprised at her father's response, albeit pleasantly. "You'll be supporting their demands for a 10-hour day next," their guest spluttered. "And why not?" Matthew replied. "If all the manufacturers agreed to it, would it be such a great problem?" Young Mr. West responded with a silent look of disbelief. "Making men, women and children work until they drop is hardly conducive to maintaining their health or our production of goods," Matthew continued, answering his own question. "When the weaver James Hargreaves, back in 1764, invented the spinning jenny, it wasn't with the intention of impoverishing his fellow workers and binding them to a machine for 12 or 14 hours a day. It was to make life easier for himself and them." "And what will they do with this extra time on their hands?" his fellow manufacturer retorted sharply. "They'll resort to the gin shops and beer taverns, that's what they'll do." Matthew Etherow shook his head. It was an argument he'd heard often, and a weak, patronising and hypocritical one at that, coming from Nathaniel's lips, a young rake, well known for bouts of drunkenness. It smacked of humbug. "The reason they frequent such places is because they have little alternative. They supply small beer and other beverages relatively safe to drink, free from sewage and animal excrement. They're also one of the few places where they can relax and engage in social intercourse with their fellow human beings after a hard day's mind-numbing labour." "They could spend time with their wives and children, surely," Mrs. West protested. Once more Matthew shook his head. "Have you ever visited the homes of any of the operatives working in your father-in-law's mill, Mrs. West?" he asked. She looked at him blankly, the whole idea being either too frightful and perhaps too horrific to contemplate, or simply beyond her comprehension. Matthew smiled and shook his head once more. "No, I suppose you won't have done so. The hovels they're reduced to living in are not for those with a delicate stomach or weak constitution. Most of them, if not all of them, are not fit to spend any length of time in. Their sleeping shelters, nothing more, and poor ones at that. The housing provision in this town is a disgrace, and needs speedy attention. The beasts of the field enjoy more comfort. However, that will all take time. In the meantime, there is much that could be done to provide facilities which will be attractive to our operatives, speedily and cheaply, where they could spend any extra leisure time in a healthy and enlightening way. Nathaniel eyed Matthew up, glaring at him. By their very nature, the working classes are their own worst enemy. They're feckless and profligate, he remonstrated. They spend all the good money we pay them as soon as they obtain it. They have no understanding of the need to be thrifty, to save and put something to one side in order to make provision for a rainy day. They don't attend church. They're atheists and drunkards. All the good money we pay them. Matthew laughed at the very idea. They're lucky to earn enough to provide themselves with the bare means of subsistence. If you can teach them how to save anything out of the derisory amount you pay them, after they've bought their starvation diet, paid their rent, and bought needle and thread to patch their ragged clothes, I will personally double every penny you can prove they can save. He paused before adding, as for going to church, Sunday is the one day they have to themselves, the one day we allow them a little rest, and to be human for a few precious hours. Once they've used up time doing their domestic chores and washing their ragged clothes, why on earth should they waste any precious time left to them on their knees, praying in a church that's a spiritual arm of their oppressors, listening to some well-fed and overpaid preacher assuring them of good times ahead once they're dead and buried? At this point he seemed to have rendered Mr. West speechless once again, but Matthew hadn't finished. The undeniable fact is, Nathaniel, it's the working people who transform nature's bounty to provide our wealth. As the economist William Petty wrote long before Adam Smith plagiarized him and only got it half right, nature is the mother of all wealth, and labour its father. It's their labour that ensures our comforts, our leisure, and all the trappings of civilization we take for granted. It's their labour that creates our capital, and without their labour our capital is worthless. Nathaniel's mouth began to open, but he seemed to have second thoughts. Matthew continued in full flow. It's our anarchic economic system that makes a god of so-called free market forces, and our insatiable greed that denies our operatives any real share in the wealth they produce. It's our system that grinds them into the dust and forces them into a quagmire of despond. That's the truth of it. When you go home to your nice, well-appointed mansion, and your maids and servants, your clean linen, and your feather beds, read your Bible, and then come back to me and explain how its teachings justify such a situation. What did you mean, Father, when you said facilities could be provided where operatives could spend any extra leisure time in a healthy and enlightening way? Well, Irene rose. For example, many, although nowhere near enough of the skilled workers, have formed mechanics' libraries, clubbing together to buy boots in order to educate themselves. Boots are subject to heavy taxes. The stamp duties are a tax on knowledge and need repealing. Additionally, we should be doing everything possible to aid our operatives so they can form mechanics' institutes, where they can study and encourage other workers and their children to take part in social and educational activities. The costs would be minor and the rewards abundant. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing, West said grimly, not liking the way the discussion was proceeding one little bit, and finding his opponent's tone more than a little offensive. True, Matthew replied quietly. A little knowledge is undoubtedly a dangerous thing. Our operatives need vast quantities of good quality education and access to fine literature and information, just as they need decent and pleasant housing, nourishing food and reasonable clothes upon their backs. They have the intellect and the practical capacity to organise it, but they lack the means in all too many cases. We have the means, and it's our duty to provide assistance." West shook his head in profound disagreement, convinced the only suitable education for his hands would teach them to accept their God-given position of servility with due humility. Irene Rose smiled as her father took up his thread. "We need to face up to facts, Nathaniel. Sooner or later the demands of the Charter will be met, and when they are met, the working people become our potential masters. We need to encourage them and ensure they're educated if we're to avoid them taking revenge for all the many calumnies we've heaped about their heads, because you can be sure of one thing, they're educating themselves slowly but surely, and they are using tracts and petty dreadfuls whose ideas you might find frightful." By now Irene Rose found it difficult to contain herself. She gazed at her father in wonder, respect, and admiration. He in turn locked his eyes onto those of Nathaniel West. 19 years ago last month this town's leading magistrates disgraced Manchester in the eyes of the civilised world. Peaceful men, women, and children were slashed with sabres, trampled by horses, and crushed to death by panic on a croft bearing a saint's name. Shelley wrote The Mask of Anarchy as a result, anarchy being his name for laissez-faire economics and the present manufacturing system. Not surprisingly, many workers can recite every single verse, word for word, and the scarcely hidden revolutionary message they contain isn't lost on them. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Just 6 years ago, we, the manufacturers, achieved representation in the House of Commons, breaking the monopoly grip of the landed aristocracy over the instruments of government, and making the Commons the sovereign body of our Parliament. We achieved that breakthrough with and because of the support of working people, whose interests we promised to advance, but then betrayed. The massacre and the continuing struggles for parliamentary reform since then made the Great Reform Act of 1832, which gave us that representation inevitable. We could not and did not achieve it on our own. Manchester now returns 2 members of Parliament. Before 1832 it returned none, whilst Old Sarum in Wiltshire, a town long abandoned and with 1 single voter, returned 2 members. Yet we still deny our operatives their rights. Nathaniel, you're an intelligent man. Try to place yourself in your employee's position and see things from their point of view. Do you really believe the working classes will sit back and allow us, their masters and exploiters, to carry on governing in league with the landowners without any challenge? They know they've won the right to vote and to stand for election for us. Now they want those rights for themselves, and I for one don't blame them. He smiled once more at his opponent. I don't know exactly how many people attended the meeting today to endorse the People's Charter. One of my contacts assures me it was no more than 60,000, whilst others have quoted figures of 120. A journalist friend employed by the Manchester Advertiser told me 300,000 attended. Whatever the number, each forsook a much-needed day's wage. Many risked losing their jobs altogether. Furthermore, the number of participants far exceeds the few hundred who at present have the right to elect our 2 Manchester members. Think on that, Nathaniel, and remember, today was only the beginning of a mighty campaign. Monday the 24th of September 1838 is a date that will still be remembered long after we're dead and buried. I hope you're right, Father, Irene Rose said quietly. Her father turned to her. I know I'm right, my dear, he said, just as I know your mother, God rest her soul, would have approved your donation of the silk for the Gibraltar Mill banner. I was proud to see such a magnificent example of our workers' skill and dedication. I intend to offer one of the rooms in the mill for its safe storage." Nathaniel West finally rose from his seat, shaking his head in despair. His fellow mill owner had all too clearly lost control of his faculties. "Come, Emma," he said grimly, "we've heard enough nonsense for one day, if not a lifetime. It's bad enough knowing the working classes are being continuously misled and whipped up into a frenzy by demagogues and union agitators, without being subject to this kind of rubbish from one of our own class." Irene Rose shook her head and smiled, wondering how her father knew about her gift, and marvelling at his proposal to provide space to store the banner. She'd paid for the silk from her own savings, and been proud to participate in the banner's manufacture, alongside Bess, Mary Upton and their colleagues. The fact her father had been so positive was an unexpected bonus. She accompanied their guests to the door, wished them good night and a safe journey home, urging them, rather mischievously and somewhat untruthfully, to keep their eyes open for the disaffected rebels and revolutionaries she'd heard stood at each of the junctions on the road between Hardwick and Didsbury. Unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. West seemed worried and distracted. They didn't thank her for entertaining them, or bother to wish her good night. Irene Rose shrugged and watched as they climbed into the brougham, patiently waiting for them outside the garden gate. She waved them away and closed the door with a smile as they drove off before returning to her father. She'd always felt he was rather special, but his performance that night had simply amazed her, and she intended to tell him so.